Good morning. I'm Alana Jacobson. I'm an assistant professor here at the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. And this morning, I'm just going to give you an update on management and knowledge about the sugarcane aphid in sorghum. So the sugarcane aphid is a pest that emerged on sorghum in Alabama in 2014. And this aphid pest, you can see there are various life stages here in this middle picture, and you have wingless adults and winged adults. This aphid will cycle through winged and wingless forms. The winged forms are responsible for migrating and infesting fields. The wingless forms have very high reproductive potential, and as you can see in the far right picture, populations can build to very high levels. And during optimal environmental conditions, these aphids can double their population size in 2 to 3 days, with a range of 2 to 8 days during the summer months. So very high population potential that causes a lot of damage in sorghum. The good thing about this aphid, I guess, from a pest management perspective, is it does have a very narrow host range. That's bad if you're growing plants in the genus sorghum, but historically, it was confined to sugarcane in Florida in the 1970s and sugarcane in Louisiana since 1999. In 2013, we started seeing economically damaging levels of this aphid in sorghum in Texas and Louisiana. And then those populations built and started expanding and moving across the South and the Southeast in 2014 and arrived in Alabama late July, early August. You don't usually find it on other plants outside of sorghum. You'll find it on sweet sorghum. They found it on some sorghum Sudan hybrids. Johnson grass is a weed host that you can find it on. There have been a couple of reports of people finding this aphid on corn, but it is not a pest of corn, and populations quickly die out. We've confirmed this with some collaborators, and we've also tested this in our greenhouse. So basically, it's just bad news if you're growing sorghum. So here's a map of its current distribution. Like I said, in 2013, populations emerged along the Gulf in Louisiana and Texas. And as you can see, this aphid has quickly expanded its range north, up through Oklahoma and Kansas, throughout the Mid-South, across the Southeast and down into Florida and all the way up into Virginia. The other interesting thing about this aphid is it doesn't have a diapause or a dormancy phase during the winter. So it overwinters on live plant tissue, and it can't survive very cold weather. So what happens seasonally with this aphid is its range is restricted down in warm climates in Texas, Florida, and maybe along the Gulf in southern Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi and Louisiana. And then during the summer months, as populations build, they'll start moving and expanding throughout the area. And then the winged forms will also migrate north on wind currents. And they basically expand their range north every year. So whether or not and when and where you're going to get infestations of sugarcane aphid are going to depend on a combination of environmental conditions that restrict overwintering range. And it's also going to depend on weather patterns and warm weather that would promote the buildup of these populations in that overwintering range, and then migration northward. So here's some pictures of some damage that are commonly experienced with high sugarcane aphid populations. Again, you have this picture in the bottom left-hand corner of high sugarcane aphid populations on the undersides of leaves. Sometimes this aphid will go undetected for a while because the populations tend to develop more quickly on the bottom of the plants and the undersides of leaves. So when you're going out and scouting, you really have to keep an eye out and make sure and check the plants thoroughly. Otherwise, you can miss them and they'll build up quickly. These high populations will cause economic losses, can really cause a lot of feeding damage on the plants. You can see that in the picture in the top left-hand corner. The aphids produce high volumes of honeydew, which can promote the growth of city mold, which can affect photosynthesis, and there's a picture in the top right-hand corner. And then high populations later on in the season, if aphid populations move up into the heads before harvesting, there can be problems with honeydew and aphid members that can interfere with harvest. And I think the biggest problems we're seeing in Texas and Mexico, but they actually had such high populations of aphids that they gummed up the combines and interfered with harvest. So the first step for IPM with this aphid, of course, is proper identification. And sugarcane aphid can be easily distinguished from other aphids that you'll find in your sorghum fields because the sugarcane aphid, here pictured in the bottom left-hand corner, has black tarsi or little feet. So at the very end of the legs, they'll have black tarsi. And then they also have black cornicles, which are these little tailpipes at the end of their abdomen. This in comparison to other aphid species, so the green bug does not have black cornicles, but it does have the black tarsi. So it can be distinguished based on the fact that there's not black cornicles. The yellow sugarcane aphid does not have black tarsi or black cornicles and looks quite different because it has a lot more hairs all over its body. And the cornleaf aphid has black cornicles, but the legs are entirely black. So the black isn't restricted only to the tarsi. When you're looking for identification, the winged forms will look a little bit different than the wingless forms, so you need to keep that in mind. The other thing you need to keep in mind is the immature phases will also exhibit a little bit more variation in these color forms. So when you're looking at these aphids, make sure that you're looking at fully grown adult aptrous aphids. So thresholds, over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of work looking at the number of aphids that causes economic loss and yield reductions in sorghum. And the number that people have generally settled on is somewhere around 125 to 135 aphids per plant will cause economic loss. Based on this and the fact that you can have patchy distributions of aphids through this field, the threshold that's been developed is if you see 20 to 25% of your plants infested with 50 aphids per leaf, then an insecticide spray is justified. And this threshold is based, uses 50 aphids per leaf just because if you'll remember I said earlier that populations can double under optimal environmental conditions in somewhere between 2 to 3 days, but definitely less than a week, even in summer months. And so this gives you enough time to get out into your field and make an application before they reach economically damaging levels. I'll talk a little bit later about differences in varieties and tolerance to sugarcane aphid, but currently these thresholds don't vary among different varieties. And there does seem to also be an impact, differences in impact of aphid density at different crop stages when the infestation occurs. We notice more economic loss and more importance of this threshold in pre-heading growth stages. Basically, the farther along the plant is, the more grain has filled, the less important these thresholds are. The only time you really have to manage sugarcane aphids late in the season after grain set is if you think there's going to be so many aphids that it's going to interfere with harvest. Right now, we're still trying to generate more data to see whether or not thresholds on different growth stages is warranted, but at this time, we don't have enough data to really give a solid recommendation. Okay, so moving on to management options for sugarcane aphid. The first thing we recommend is to use an insecticide seed treatment to suppress aphid populations early in the growing season. There are 4 different seed treatments that we've tested in Alabama, and these have been tested by a lot of my research and extension counterparts in neighboring states as well. And basically, all of these seed treatments will provide some sort of aphid suppression for 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes more if you have, just depending on growing conditions. But basically what this does is this gives you time to detect the infestations before you need to make an insecticide application. If you need to make an insecticide application, the 2 products that we're currently recommending are Transform and Savanto. We did receive a Section 18 for Transform in Alabama. We've looked at a number of other chemistries as well. We've looked at pyrethroids, lorsban, dimethylate, and then tank mixes of lorsban and dimethylate. And we don't recommend these products because the results are variable. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of suppression for 5 days to a week, but populations can rebound very quickly. Or sometimes we didn't see suppression at all under high infestation levels. So if you're going to make an application, Transform and Savanto are the two best products. The other thing we're recommending is so Savanto generally will provide about a week longer control than Transform at the high rate. And it seems to be a little bit, so just give a little bit longer control. They're both good products, but the one thing we want to recommend also is insecticide rotation, just to try and delay resistance development. And so this is an excerpt from the insecticide mode of action classification. And basically, I just wanted to drive home this point by showing that all of the compounds currently used for sugarcane aphid management, from the seed treatments to Transform and Savanto, are all working on the exact same target site. So they're believed to have slightly different modes of action, but they're very closely related. And the threat of insecticide resistance development is high, partially because they're closely related, and partially because this aphid has such a limited host range. The majority of the populations are going to be concentrated on sorghum during the growing season, and everybody from Texas to Virginia are using the same suite of chemicals to control them. So the last thing I wanted to say about insecticides before we wrapped up is just put it also into the context of how applications for other insect pests of sorghum may influence sugarcane aphid management. There's been a little bit of research, and there's ongoing research looking at best management practices and IPM plans for the complex of pests that we experience in sorghum. And to date, the main concern is that pyrethroid applications that are targeted at the sorghum midge may negatively impact sugarcane aphid management. And this is partially because the pyrethroids are harmful to beneficial pests that may provide a little bit of suppression for sugarcane aphid, but pyrethroids also seem to flare sugarcane aphid populations. So if you have sugarcane aphid populations at a time when you're managing sorghum midge, you'll need to keep this in mind and keep a close eye on your aphid populations. In some research trials that went on looking at interactions between applications of Savanto and Transform on headworm control, there didn't seem to be any negative interactions there. And like I said, there's currently research underway to look at combinations of insecticides for these suite of pests throughout the season. So hopefully we'll continue to get some good information out about this. So the next topic I wanted to talk about was varietal resistance against sugarcane aphid. So there's been a lot of work looking at different varieties, and there's a list of tolerant hybrids that I'll direct you to at the link at the bottom of this page. United Sorghum Checkoff Program has compiled a list of all of the varieties that have been evaluated and have been shown to exhibit some sort of tolerance to sugarcane aphid. And you can see in these pictures, this is a trial that we conducted down in Fairhope in 2015. These are different varieties that were not treated with any insecticide application, so we just wanted to see how these varieties performed. There was very high insect pressure in this year, and you can see that we got a range of responses. You have dead sorghum plots in the middle of the picture to very healthy sorghum. So there are differences among varieties. What I will say, though, is that it's really hard to peg down which variety is best. And this is because you'll have varieties that are just better adapted to some growing areas than others. The first thing I want to say, though, is that even though some of these varieties do exhibit tolerance to sugarcane aphid populations, they'll slow their development, but they don't generally eliminate the need for an insecticide spray, especially under high pressure situations. So even though you grow a tolerant variety, it doesn't mean that you can not scout for these pests or not expect to put out an insecticide application, but it might buy you some time in between scouting and in between detection and when they're actually going to reach the economic threshold. What I would currently recommend in terms of a variety is to, based on the fact that you're still going to need to put out an insecticide application if you get sugarcane aphid, is to choose a variety that's well adapted for your area. I put out some variety trials in Bruton, Alabama, Fairhope, and Headland and Prattville. And there seems to be a variety of environmental effects, so the amount of rainfall, how healthy that sorghum is, how well it's growing, the genetics of that variety and just how tolerant to sugarcane aphid they really are, and also the aphid population pressure experienced in any area that ultimately determines how well these varieties are going to perform and how much tolerance you're actually going to see in any given year at any given location. So if it were me, I would just plant a good locally adapted variety, monitor for sugarcane aphid, and expect to have to put out an insecticide spray if needed. The other thing I'll say is it seems like over the years we are seeing a lot more beneficial insects out there eating sugarcane aphids that are present in the field. And even though we see a wide variety of beneficials, and they're probably providing some sort of benefit, especially on alternate hosts such as Johnson grass in the landscape, they're not really, at this point in time, suppressing aphid populations below economic thresholds. But we're currently doing more research trying to better understand the impact of natural enemies on these populations. So in summary, if you're going to plant sorghum, first and foremost, choose just a good locally adapted variety that grows well at your location. Keep an eye on environmental growing conditions that might negatively impact sorghum. If you experience a little bit of drought stress, that could exacerbate problems that you have with sugarcane aphid. We recommend using an insecticide seed treatment to protect that sorghum crop from planting to 3 to 4 weeks out. Ongoing research looking at IPM practices IPM practices to manage sugarcane aphid. We're also looking at effects of planting date. We did one trial last year where we had an early and late planting date that were really towards the middle and late planting window for sorghum last year. And I think currently the consensus is to plant during the optimal growing conditions for agronomic reasons in your area, because again, it helps establish the sorghum and the sorghum will grow better during that. In Alabama, I think they recommend earlier planting dates do better than later planting dates. And early planting dates, you might also avoid a little bit of aphid pressure or deal with aphid pressure when the plants are at a later growth stage, which could also help decrease losses due to sugarcane aphid. I can't stress enough the importance of scouting and scouting weekly for this pest until you detect it. Once you detect this pest, you might want to go out and scout more than once a week just to keep an eye on populations, since they can build up very quickly. With insecticides, we've got 2 good insecticide options, Savanto and Transform. Again, recommend rotating those chemicals to try and delay insecticide resistance development. And after you make that application, continue monitoring populations, make sure they don't rebound, and monitor late in the season to make sure that you don't have high populations that could interfere with harvesting. So with that, I'd like to just thank Kathy Flanders and a graduate student that I had working on this project. We did a lot of field trials, and a lot of this information was also contributed by collaborators in neighboring states. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any.